John, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, sure. My name is John Higgs. I'm an author in the south of England. I've written a lot of things. My last book was about James Bond and the Beatles. It was called Love and Let Die. But before that one, I wrote a book called William Blake versus the World, about the 18th century, mystic and visionary and artist and all-round bewildering genius that is William Blake. So yeah, and anything British that begins with the letter B, I'm all over basically.
Bangers and mash. All right. So William Blake, tell me about who that is, because I am not very familiar with him, and I don't imagine most of my audience, who are mostly American, are also very not familiar with him. So please tell us about William Blake.
Oh, he's a wonderful person to find out about. He's a little bit of a sort of secular English saint over here. He's bewildering. He's confusing. He's as well known as a poet as he is a visual artist, as a painter, which starts to sort of indicate the uniqueness of him. No one's as good as a poet as they are as a visual painter. His words to what are now the hymn Jerusalem are very much the English unofficial national anthem. So he's very close to the heart of I want to say mystical side of Britain, or a dream of England that's better than we are now. But also some of the artwork that he was producing is just stunning. It's just unlike anything, not just done in the 1800s, but anything done now. He was very much a visionary. He saw in his mind everything that he painted. He saw angels. He conversed with spiritual beings. And because of this, he was mocked. He was sort of ridiculed. He was dismissed. It's very easy to see his life as a tragedy, really. He had one exhibition in his lifetime, which was above his brother's shop, and he sold nothing. And he got one review, which called him an unfortunate lunatic. And he was buried in a pauper's burial in Bunhill Fields on the outskirts of London, to be forgotten. But here, 200 years later, I should say, he's probably one of the most important creative Englishmen that has ever lived. And his name is held up there with like Chaucer, with John Milton, with Shakespeare, as one of our true greats. It's not so much a rags to riches. It's sort of a madness to respectability sort of story. And there's something so rewarding about trying to see the world as he did and trying to understand what he was communicating to us, that makes the discovery of William Blake just a great thing to have in your life. I heartily recommend anyone who doesn't know anything about Blake just to give it a second look. It will make your life better. It will enrich the experience of just being you. There's not many artists you can say that about.
So the first thing is, you mentioned he lived in the 1800s, and you first called him a secular saint, but then you also mentioned that he spoke to angels.
Yeah.
So what was his religious beliefs, his beliefs about the world, and tell me more about when he lived and why that is significant to his journey.
Yeah, I think that does need a bit of explanation. The fascinating thing about Blake is he doesn't fit into any box that you particularly want to put him into. He would have described himself as a Christian. He saw himself as a Christian, and that was that. It was a simple thing. And yet his definition of Christianity wouldn't really ring true to many modern day Christians. He didn't, for example, go to church. He was very angry and dismissive of the church, of priests, of priestcrafts. He complained of priests in their gowns of doing their rounds and binding in briars my joys and desires. He thought that the church was crushing the true human spirit. He referred to God as Nobo Daddy. It sounds a very modern name, sort of mix up between nobody and daddy. There's the great Nobo Daddy in the sky. All of this doesn't sound very Christian to people. But that's not just the only box he doesn't quite fit into. There's a lot in his thought that seems like Gnosticism. But it's not quite right, because he viewed humanity and the human body as part of the soul, essentially. There's a lot that seems like Taoism. There's a lot kind of that you can argue is atheistic, in that the spirit, the God, only exists where there is man. All the gods are inside us. Angels, demons, heaven and hell. These are all internal states that he's sort of wrestling with. So he doesn't quite fit into any box like this. And he has this strange ability of appealing to, agnostics and atheists as much as the religious and the spiritually inclined. And it's basically his definition of Christ was the imagination. Right? The imagination was the divine entering our world, to the extent that he would say things like God and all, Jesus and all his assistants were artists. You cannot be a Christian if you're not a painter or a writer or anything like that. It was creativity and imagination was the divine element entering the otherwise, fixed, finite, material world, and making it more and making it better. It's these odd ideas. These are kind of hard to sort of get your head around when you first encounter Blake, which is why he can appear so, strange and bewildering. But the more you engage with them, the more you can see there is a sort of consistent vision of the world, which was not one that he was taught. Essentially, he didn't go to school. He had a great freedom in his childhood, wandering the lanes of London and out into the countryside, and just having a level of freedom that modern day children couldn't sort of comprehend. So he wasn't taught to think in a certain way. And for Blake, I'm sorry if I'm going far too deep into all this here, but trying to sort of explain it. But for Blake, his thought sort of clashed with one of the most deeply held beliefs in the entirety of Western thought, which was that the soul and matter were separate things, that the mind and matter were different. And that's an idea that's so deeply embedded. You find it in Plato. It predates Plato. It was an important part of early Christianity. This idea that there's the world of matter, and then there's the world of forms. That there is the world divine beyond that. And so, all the great universities of England, Oxbridge, Cambridge, it was buried at the heart this idea that the divine was beyond, was away, was separate. And it's a very Western idea, and you don't find it in Chinese thought, and you don't find it in Indian or Vedic thought or anything like that. But he was having nothing to do with it. He just disbelieved it. So at the heart of how he saw the world, it's just different. It's just a different way of doing it. And the more you explore it, the more you go, it's kind of valid. It is kind of valid. I think I went far too deep too quickly there, Tom, didn't I? I'm sorry.
Well, no, I was actually quite leading to my next. Well, that was leading to my next question. So, because you said he spoke to angels, or he was told that he was speaking to angels, what does that mean to him that he's speaking to angels? Because you mentioned that he says Jesus and his followers were artists, and that he defined religion as the imaginary. If that's the case, what does it mean when he says he speaks to angels?
Yeah, I mean, when you say it defines it as the imaginary, it's not. It's tempting to see that as downplaying it, as to sort of bringing it to a less important sort of level. Blake would have thought he was really raising up humanity and raising up the human imagination. These things still were divine. It's just that they were, as he said, God only acts and is in existing beings, in existing beings and men. yeah, he needed to be there, and he saw these visions throughout his entire life, essentially, from a small child to being an old man. There's a lovely story when he was about 8 years old, and he went out for a walk out of London into the countryside, and he got to Peckham Rye, and he's sitting under this tree, and he's looking up, and on every branch he sees an angel. The whole tree is enchanted. The whole tree is sort of spangled like that. And he goes home and he tells his parents, and they just think he's lying. And it's kind of like the moment when he realizes that not everyone saw the world as he did. And he was nearly beaten by his father, and his mother had to sort of step in and stop that. So he knew that, he wasn't mad. He knew that other people didn't see what he was seeing. He knew that it was part of his imagination. It was a combination of his imagination and the world beyond. But it was so rewarding, and it was so enchanting to see the world in these terms. He thought that everybody should do it. It was the imagination was a muscle that can be strengthened, and everybody should be able to see the world in these sort of visionary and imaginary terms. And that's really a lot of his work is trying to sort of stress that, to sort of trying to persuade other people to sort of come with him and sort of strengthen that part of us, strengthen that inner light that is the imagination. And it was just central to his entire work and his entire understanding of everything. And for people who denied it or dismissed it or just thought he was mad, it was not funny to him, but he knew how much they were losing out on. He knew how much they were sort of missing. He would never try and persuade people that it was true, because he didn't quite see the point. If they couldn't see it, they couldn't see it, and that's fair enough. He understood that a lot of people had a worldview with no concept of transcendence in it, and their world was fixed and finite. And there's a lot of characters in his work, particularly a character called Urizen, who see the world in that term. They think they're rational, even though really they're just rationalizing. Yeah. So I fear I'm rambling, Tom. It's
That is the point, though, to ask the questions
yeah.
and to get information. That is the goal, so I'm very happy you are. You mentioned that he had a very free childhood, he didn't go to school. Was he in a wealthy family? Did he have lots of, opportunities to be privileged in a way that gave him not the same, because education in many ways affects children in a detrimental way by curbing their, creativity, and why was he free of that burden in his
Well,
childhood?
because he wasn't from a wealthy family. He was real merchant class. He didn't have the advantages that a lot of the artists of London in the late 1700s, early 1800s had. He was very much a working class, grafting creator. And he trained in printing, and he was an engraver, and he earned a bit of a living in engraving. But it really was sort of, it was the time of the Industrial Revolution, and he was there with, acids and metals and great big sort of presses, and sort of automating the process of work, and scratching away at metal, and sort of working sort of in an industrial almost way. And then when we think of Blake, we often associate him with the Romantics, who came slightly afterwards, which was a lot more about, very privileged people sort of lounging around, drinking laudanum, or writing on quills, or waiting for the muses to descend and sort of, give them inspiration. But for Blake, it was about work. And it was work that was needed to be done to transform our world, into the paradise that it should be. It was very much the creation and art in general that was the thing that was going to turn London into Jerusalem, to turn our sort of mundane lives into this sort of golden, wonderful experience where we should be living. Paradise was our birthright, and the fact that we weren't there was something that had to be worked to overcome, I think.
Was that like one of his goals? What was his main goal, his main drive?
Yeah, I think I think you could say that was his main drive. If you look at his later epic sort of poetry, the way that I find it helpful to explain. I was talking earlier about how he said all gods, all demons, or angels were insiders. They live in the human breast, as he writes in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. It seems an odd idea, but if you think of something like hell, in the fairly secular 21st century, there's not a lot of people who genuinely think that hell is a place that exists sort of over there somewhere. They could sort of go there. Not a lot of people really think that, but at the same time, we've probably all met someone who is living in hell. And I think we all know deep down that to deny that or would be wrong. And if you accept that someone can be living in hell, then that raises the idea that, well, we could be in paradise as well. We could live in paradise. That suddenly becomes plausible. And so a large focus of his work was about how we do that, because certainly by the end of his life, he was living in paradise. He was, for a penniless, dismissed artist, he was in bliss. And he thinks that's exactly how we should be, and that's how everyone should be. And I think that's what's so striking about his work, and so disturbing almost about it. A lot of it's very creepy or gothic or melodramatic or strange, but it's sort of hinting that the way you are now ain't enough. That should go. There's a much better way to be. Just if you can just get past what he called the mind forged manacles, it does want to sort of shatter your existing worldview and put you in a more numinous place. And to do that, that light has to come from yourself. That spark of not spark that illumination, that divinity, does have to be generated by your imagination and projected out into the world. When he's talking about turning London into Jerusalem, into this golden city, he's not talking about someone physically going out and replacing the pavements with golden slabs or something like that. It's a mental exercise. It's a mental sort of state, and you get the sense from his work that it's possible, that we could do this, and it kind of matters, because we're only on this planet for a very short period, and it's our all this is about the state of our soul, for a want of a word, want of a better way of putting it. The soul, it's very easy to dismiss in the 21st century, but you read Blake, you go, hang on, no, this kind of matters. How you exist.
You mentioned that he had bliss at the end of his life, and that he was talking about how he can have this particular state of mind and overcome it and achieve something greater. Was the bliss at the end of his life this psychological state he's referring to, and what in particular was it? What are the shackles that he's referring to, and what does it mean to overcome it? What did his life look like at the end of his life, and was that the fulfillment of overcoming those shackles?
Well, he was essentially at peace. There's some great descriptions of him in the 1820s as he's getting towards the end of his life, where people will meet him at a dinner party and they'll just fall for him because he's charming, but there's a childlike quality to him, a delight in children and laughter and playing and music and things like that. But the things he talks of are so wonderful, really. So sort of beautiful, and it would be very easy, given the life that he'd had, not to end up in that state, to end up bitter, to end up dark and projecting that darkness sort of out on the world. Because certainly in the first decade of the 1800s, he was in a much more paranoid state, and his mental health was in quite a bad way at that sort of point. And it's very easy to imagine a trajectory to his life where he's sort of defeated by the world and defeated by the art establishment and broken by the rejection and end up bitter, essentially. But through his work, that didn't happen. And his final days in this tiny little room, the people who visited him would talk about going to this room as if they were going, to somewhere outside of the normal world, an enchanted place, a sparkling sort of place, just by the sheer presence of him. In the way that some people talk of, saints as just different, just to something about them and being in their presence. It's tangible. Blake, the later descriptions of Blake, he has that sort of quality of it. And when he died, there's accounts of him lying in bed, just seeing the angels around him and just singing. He was just singing his way out of life. And you think, that's got to be, a better life than many. You see a lot of angry ranters on the internet, social media sort of places, and that sort of that fury and that sort of kind of they're projecting their own struggles out onto the world and labeling the world as they are. Basically, that happens a lot. So when you find someone who's trying to tell you how the world is, and they end up that way, and they end up at peace with the world, you kind of know there's a lot more truth to what they're saying than to someone who ends up in a dark place, I think.
And you mentioned that 200 years back in his time period, he wasn't very revered, but 200 years later, he is. What is it about his work that is revered? What was the movement that he made that left such an impression on society today?
Yeah, I mean, just before the lockdown, before the pandemic, there was a huge retrospective just of his painting, not even his poetry, just of his paintings at Tate Britain in London. And it sold about 250,000 tickets, and there's over 300 works there, and it was just awe-inspiring to have all that sort of together, and to see him coming from just that pauper's burial that I mentioned earlier to the place that he is now, does take some understanding, and it's fascinating the way how his stature has sort of grown as people have slowly started to unlock his work. It's sort of taken us 200 years to understand it, essentially. There was a wonderful biography written about him in 1863, which we're so grateful for, by Alexander Gilchrist, and it was called William Blake, Pictura Ignotus, which was Latin for William Blake, an unknown painter. It was a biography of an unknown painter. And even that book, which is important because it spoke to a lot of people who knew him, so we have a lot of records of him. There's some of his greatest works. That biographer's going, yeah, I don't understand any of this. This is just crazy. This is just sort of crazy. But slowly over the following 200 years, there's been a lot of academic work. There's a lot of artistic movements that are sort of inspired by him, or in things like the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. The arrival of the Romantic movement in general was sort of a way to sort of frame him. A lot of his poems got picked up by Victorian anthology editors who thought they were patriotic when he didn't quite understand what they were. So they sort of got taught. But really, I think it was about in the 1960s when sort of the post-war generation had this great counterculture period of Allen Ginsberg and the psychedelic era and all these things, and they were into their own individualism, and they were into sexual liberation and an anti-authoritarian thing, and they still had space for a bit of spiritual. So Blake was everything they wanted. Everything they was looking for was there in Blake. So you get, certainly Ginsberg became a poet because of Blake, and you had people like Aldous Huxley writing about mescaline for the book. He needed a title. The only person he could think of who was really talking about these things was Blake. So he went to Blake to title his books like The Doors of Perception. And then the Doors, the band, would go to Aldous Huxley and take that. So he became very much part of the counterculture. But it's not just the counterculture. We have a big patriotic celebration called the Last Night of the Proms here in the UK, and it's all flag waving, and it's at the Royal Albert Hall, and it's broadcast on the BBC, and it always has to end with Jerusalem, which includes Blake's lyrics to this thing Jerusalem. It becomes, it's very much seen as an establishment thing, and Eton and private schools like that, they all like to sing William Blake's words and stuff like that, despite the fact that if they understood what they were and understood the radical nature of them, and understood that essentially they're calling for the overthrow of the sort of the mediocrities that sort of make up the British establishment, they probably wouldn't sing them. But Jerusalem is sung by the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. It's sung by the Women's Institute movement. It's sung by the English cricket team. It's sung by post-punk bands like The Fall, or punk folk singers like Billy Bragg. It appeals to the left and the right. It appeals to the establishment and the counterculture. And as I said earlier, it sort of can appeal to agnostic or atheistic people as well as the spiritually inclined. It's incredibly uniting because it comes from a perspective that's larger than anything else. It's sort of it's almost like he's outside looking in. I find it very interesting that the most used word in all his writings is all. All is the most word. It's all encompassing. And whatever your interest, whether you go to Blake because you're curious about the radical side of him, or the political side of him, or the sexual side of him, or the spiritual side of him, or the artistic side of him, whichever way you go into him, you kind of find what you want. He's so big and he's so all-encompassing that of course of course he grows in our stature. There aren't that many people that good, basically. Aren't that many people that interesting. And we're still kind of unpicking bits. Nobody would say, "Oh, we understand him now. We understand everything he said." We're still trying to sort of decipher it. And it seems that, as we progress as a culture, as we develop and learn new things, we sort of realize that he was ahead of us all this time, and we're just sort of catching up with him. And he seems to be more and more not just a crazy old mystic from centuries past, but a man whose worldview is the sort of the light that we're sort of drawn to.
So what is his worldview exactly? And you've mentioned Jerusalem a few times. What does Jerusalem mean to William Blake?
Well, Jerusalem comes up a lot. It was one of the real epic, lengthy illustrated poems that he did towards the end of his life, that he considered his great masterwork. And it's tempting to see it as a sort of a work of proto-psychology. He was 100 years before Freud and Jung and people like that. But a lot of his work was attempting to understand the clashing energies of the mind, which he personified. He personified different aspects of us, and he created this extraordinary mythology entirely of his own. As he wrote, "I must create my own system or be enslaved by another man." Most artists or writers or poets at the time, they would use, classical mythology or biblical stories as the sort of a shared mythologies that everybody would know. And, obviously Blake loved the biblical stories and never stopped using those. But the Greek and the Roman stuff, he just didn't, it wasn't right as far as he could see. The worldview was right. So he created his own mythology, um, which he never really properly explained to anyone. It's kind of like he thought, well, I know what everything represents and what everything means, so other people should. So we'll create these characters called, the Urizen is a famous one, and we don't know how they're pronounced because they're just words he made up, and it could be Urizen or Urizen. We've got no idea. And Los and Anatharman and they represent different aspects of us. One represents. He divided the mind into four, which he called the four zoas. And one is the creative side of us, of course, the imaginative side, which is very, very important, but also the rational and the physical and the emotional. And he sort of creates them as almost not godlike characters, but mythological beings who all have like a female counterpart, but they all have their own shadow. And so this huge cast sort of comes up, and he's very much exploring what happens when you clash these different parts of the mind together to try and understand them. And it's very easy to read as a work of kind of proto-psychology, really. And for me, I think the fact that he was so at peace at the end of his life does come from the work he was doing. I think he did finally understand his own sort of clashing mental energies. He sort of put the work in basically, and got his eyes cleared, and escaped the mind forged manacles that society sort of puts on us. So essentially the big project of his life was this mythology and expressing this mythology and trying to and trying to use it to understand himself, and by himself understand everyone. I'd put it that way.
Was there a particular catalyst or a particular point in his life where he transitioned from the more stressful, anxious to this calming state? And was it a piece of work or something, some kind of principle that we can express to other people? What was the thing that really helped him to understand more about himself and move to that more relaxed state?
Yeah, I would say it was Jerusalem, the epic poet Jerusalem. That was in the early 1800s. It took him about 20 years to do this, and then every page was sort of engraved and could be printed and could be coloured, and there was paintings within it, and it was sort of a wonderful sort of thing. And the work he did after that, he did some pages based on the Book of Job. He did the Divine Comedy. He did stuff on the Pilgrim's Progress. These are all stories kind of a soul being redeemed. They were all stories of someone, arriving at the shining city there, or overcoming with Job, overcoming everything that the devil throws at them to sort of have that elevated sort of golden state. I'd say Jerusalem was the turning point, but it's probably not the best place for anyone to start. It's a bit of a tricky one. Is Jerusalem? It's a bit of a challenge. That and the Four Zoas and a big poem called Milton. I always recommend people look up a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is quite a short thing from the early 1790s, which encompasses his worldview as clearly as anything else. He was basically writing it to disagree with Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish mystic. And in criticizing Swedenborg, he just states how he sees things much clearer than anywhere else. And it's sharp, and it's punchy, and it's funny. It's very funny in places. Has this great big section called the Proverbs of Hell, where he lists the wisdom, the infernal wisdom that he's picked up on his travels. And it's partly because Swedenborg was a visionary who also went to heaven and went to hell and wrote about them in his book Heaven and Hell. But he was a very privileged a member of Swedish society. He was sort of wealthy. He knew the king and things, and he was basically he was kind of on the side of the angels, right? And for Blake, you can't have heaven without hell. You can't have one without the other. Contraries were a huge part of his philosophy. To just focus on paradise and ignore hell meant you didn't understand either. You needed them both to have any real sort of understanding. Hence, the marriage of heaven and hell. He was sort of joining these concepts together, because without each other, they were sort of meaningless. There's this his world was built up on, I say, these opposites, on contraries, and it's kind of like when a baby's born, it's has no concept, no mental model of the world outside it. It has all this information coming in from its senses, from its eyes and its ears, but it doesn't really know what it was. It's just chaos. It can't sort of make sense out of any of it. So slowly it works out that like there's day and night, there's darkness and there's light. It sort of sees these as different sort of things. It's why babies really like checkerboards. That when they're very young, they don't see color. I mean, they do physically see color, but they mentally haven't grasped the concept of color, and they don't really know what it is. So it's black and white are the first sort of things that they start to build up their mental model of the world. And then it's things like, there's hot and cold, they understand, or hungry and not hungry. And so all these concepts, long and short, or heavy and light and things like that, we grasp them by understanding their opposite. And our mental model of the world is built up in these contraries and built up in these opposites. And so heaven and hell are aspects of our experience. And you kind of need them both. You just can't just have heaven by itself. But if you understand hell, then you can get heaven as well. All this is sort of fundamental in his stuff. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I would recommend as the one to go for.
So what were his vices and virtues? Was he big into drugs? Did he use drugs as a form of inspiration?
No, and in the 1960s, there was a wide belief that he had, that maybe he was on mushrooms, which grow in southern England and stuff like that, mainly because people were taking mushrooms and then reading Blake and thinking, I know exactly where this guy's coming from. This makes total sense to me. But the use of psychedelic mushrooms for consciousness reasons in that period, in around 1800, is totally ahistoric. There's no records of it happening, and whenever someone did take a mushroom, they just thought, I've been possessed by demons, or I've gone mad, or I'm going to die. And it was a nightmare. It was a horrible sort of thing. And that's the only sort of records we have of that. We didn't have an Aldous Huxley or a Timothy Leary to sort of frame it in the sort of positive way that people could sort of grasp. And the fact that he's having these visions from being a small child right up until the end of his life, all this suggests that it's not he wasn't taking a psychedelic or an entheogen or some sort of stimulant to get himself in that mind. It was just something he could do. It was just something he could do. But it is interesting, because there is a lot of research into the mind on psychedelics that's been going on just in the last decade or two, really, which I think can be used to sort of help grasp Blake's mind. In certain ways, so there were certain similarities of things going on there, but it was natural. It was just how he was, I guess, lucky enough to be born, really.
And what were his vices and virtues?
Oh, vices and virtues. Well, vices. I mean, there was certainly a period in his early marriage where he seemed very keen on uh, women who weren't his wife. Now, there's no evidence that he had an affair or something like that, but there is evidence in poems that this really hurt his wife, and she was very upset about it. But the significance of sexual liberation was so far ahead of its time in his work. If you look at there's a book, The Visions of the Daughters of Albion, which is essentially arguing that women had the right to be sexually fulfilled. Um, and it was written in what 1792, something like that. You know, it's extraordinary piece of work. But because, you know, as Blake saw it, uh, sexual ecstasy and spiritual ecstasy, they were both ecstasy. It was about the experience of ecstasy. This is, you know, how human beings can be. The great pleasures and the great joys of life are there to be experienced. And to deny them, as the church was doing, he saw was just this awful wrong. You know, this great crime on humanity to sort of stamp out, you know, the pleasures people can find with themselves and find with other people. So this, yeah, so this for all he and his wife are just a really lovely story, and they were really there for each other for their entire life. And Catherine, you know, she believed him. She believed in his vision. She believed in all his work, and he would have been lost without her. And they just doted on each other. But for all that, you know, maybe whether you want to say class it as his virtue or his vices, but you know, sexual desire and liberation as part of the human experience was definitely a big part of. He didn't have the money to gamble. You know, he didn't drink massively. So yeah, that's probably the closest that would answer that question, I think, Tom.
You mentioned that given the life he had had, you would expect many people would be justified in being very bitter. What was the life that he had? What are the things that happened to him that you think could have influenced him in a negative way, but ended up helping him
Yeah,
to achieve more?
I think I think it's just been dismissed as mad, and his talent ignored and his work ignored. I mentioned earlier that in 1809 he had his one solo exhibition in his life, and you know, sold nothing, and had one review that described him as an unfortunate lunatic whose personal inoffensiveness keeps him from incarceration. But it was such a patronising review. It was this establishment critic sort of coming to this working class artist, and sort of going, oh, they think they can draw. It's just it's so condescending, um, and that kind of was, you know, Britain is such a class-ridden place even today, and the you know the establishment genuinely believe that they're the best, right? And if you know outside of that, well, they just it's very sort of patronizing sort of place, and that's what he received time and time again. And the great, I say that the most successful painters and artists of that time are completely unknown to us now because their work means nothing. It's just all been forgotten. It maybe hit a nerve at the time, but it says nothing about the universal nature of being alive. Whereas this very poor, and at times in his life he was extremely poor, working class, large. Well, I mean, no, he wasn't self-taught, but self-driven creator who just saw lesser talents, you know, getting great big patronages and being, you know, being sent on grand tours and great favors coming to people who didn't really deserve it. Well, he was just continually working away and getting no recognition and getting no sales and getting no appreciation. You could see that breaking someone, really, couldn't you? But I mean, as he saw it, he was so rich on every level that mattered, except financially, and except on worldly sort of levels. On spiritual levels, he was. He almost couldn't believe his luck. His life was that illuminated, was that shining, was that wonderful. I mean, that's partly why I called the book William Blake versus the World, because the story of the world versus William Blake can seem quite a tragic thing, but that wasn't how he saw it. It was the other way around. He was operating in completely different territory to how other people judged their lives, and from his perspective, his life was a total success because it was just so numinous.
You mentioned he wasn't self-taught. Where was he taught? How did he learn art and poetry and painting?
Yes, that's right. He was. I mean, he didn't go to school for about the first decade or so of his life, and his dad was a merchant, as I say, and they decided that, well, maybe he'd be sent away to learn engraving because he was clearly talented and he was, clearly had a great aptitude for art and poetry and things like that. But at the time, you'd have to be from a well-connected family to become, say, a portrait painter or something like that, where the money could be made. Engraving was it was a craft. It was something you could sort of fall back on. It was the sensible sort of option. And yeah, he went away and did train in engraving. So and in quite an old-fashioned style of engraving that was very much focused on the line, and it was quite gothic. A lot of his stuff, it sort of the fashions for prints at the time became quite sort of florid and pretty and things like that, and not the hellfire and demons that Blake was sort of producing.
What was his inspiration as he changed earlier in life versus later in life? What inspired him and motivated him? And what was his occupation during that time period?
Well, he was an engraver his entire life. And he didn't really sort of change. He just kept on doing what he was doing, whether people were paying attention or not. But there certainly was a period where the friends that he had were commissioning him slightly out of charity to sort of keep him going. There was a friend, William Haley, who had a place on Felpham on the Sussex coast, on the south coast of England, and he suggested to Blake and his wife that they move down there and do a lot of work for him. He was having this library decked out in this big house, and he needed lots of sort of paintings and things like that. So people were sort of giving him work, but it wasn't really enough. They were certainly hungry at times. They were certainly struggling at times, and certainly towards the end of his life, he's just in very small rooms, and everything's old and falling apart. And but he spends his last money on pencils and art equipment and things like that. He wasn't really able to provide his wife with the life that she deserved, and so on. But yeah, he didn't change. He just kept doing what he was doing.
When do you think was the shift when he started to become more popular? What was the things that caused him to become more popular in modern society?
Well, a big one would be when around the First World War, when Hubert Parry put music to the lyrics to what became the hymn Jerusalem, um, and then dedicated or gave away the copyright to Jerusalem to the women's suffrage movement. So it was always had that sort of radical sort of edge to it. And it is, I don't know if you know the hymn Jerusalem. You would do if you lived in England. It's England doesn't have a national anthem. Officially, it doesn't have one. The idea is you have to sing the British national anthem, which at the moment is "God Save the King." So in the World Cup, England would have to sing "God Save the King." Scotland and Wales are much more canny. They've got much better tunes than that. But as I say, England doesn't. We kind of do, and everyone knows that it's Jerusalem. But it's not being imposed on us. It's not being sort of handed down from on high, and we're not told this is your national anthem. Everybody's just chosen it, and everybody agrees that yes, Jerusalem really is the sort of the English national anthem, which kind of makes it a little bit more special. And it's not a hymn that's, oh, we're so great, we're the best people. It's instead, it's like, oh, we could be good. We could be good. There was moments in the past that give us about we could be good in the future. It's a sort of a yearning to be better than we are, which makes it much more preferable to a lot of the sort of the really sort of patriotic, jingoistic sort of anthems that there are out there. So that, and a lot of poems like the tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. These have been passed down, and a lot of English students look at these and see them again and again. But there's so many different paintings or different poems or different works that you'll come across something, and it just sort of grabs you. It's just like a window into a completely different world, and it's just like, what's that? When people first see a lot of Blake's paintings and a lot of Blake's images, and certainly if people are listening to all this and they still are unaware of a lot of his artworks, just go on Google Images and just look at Blake's paintings, and it's just they're so striking and so strange and so otherworldly that what they do is they sort of convince you, of the reality of transcendence. You look at them and you know that he's been in those places that he's talking about. And when I'm talking about states or seeing the world as Jerusalem, having that lighting, that inner light, sort of changing the world into a paradise. You look at those images and he's done that, and it's a real thing, rather than just I don't know, wishful thinking or something like that.
So how did you get introduced to William Blake?
Oh, I mean, he's always been around. I can remember in school we saw some of his paintings, particularly a picture called the Ancient of Days, which is this. You would assume it was God, this figure leaning out of this sort of golden orb in this sort of strange dark void, and his beard and his hair is being blown sideways by strange winds, and he's leaning forward with a golden compass, sort of creating the sort of fixed, finite world. And it looks so much like how you'd imagine God would be, that when that exhibition at Tate Britain that I mentioned in 2019 was on to publicise it, they projected that image onto the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, and it looked amazing. It was slightly animated, and it just looked brilliant. But of course, all people who understand Blake thought it was hilarious, because that figure, as they know, is Urizen. He's sort of basically our left brain. He's the sort of the rational lawmaking sort of side of us, who thinks he's God. But as Blake explains, Urizen is Satan. That essentially projected Satan onto the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral. which is a very typical thing to happen around Blake. You know, when the establishment sort of use him, they get him so wrong that it is quite funny. So, but yeah, when you see an image like that, it never kind of leaves you. It really does leave a mark on you, sort of something like that. The level of design in his work is just exquisite. There's a painting of two angels above the dead body of Jesus in the tomb, and it's so ethereal and it's so fragile, and they're so faint. These white figures, but their wings are sort of above their head, and they just sort of reach and they just sort of touch at the very top, and the whole thing is like architecture. It's like structured like architecture, and these ethereal sort of angels suddenly become as timeless and as fixed as stone in that, and it's such a striking image. And English artists weren't doing anything like that in the 1800s. You know, that's just it's just from another world. You know, yeah. You might another image is the Red Dragon and the woman clothed in the sun, which was used in the film The Red Dragon, the Hannibal Lecter movie, and the serial killer is so obsessed by this picture, and he eats it, he consumes it. So there's always that sort of horror movie side of Blake, that sort of gothic-y sort of side of him. You know, you find him in comics, you find him in video games, you find him in graffiti. You know, you don't just find him being, you know, passed down from on high. He sort of gets everywhere. So he will find you if you're receptive, I think.
Well, what was it specifically about his work that got you so enthralled with William Blake? When did that happen?
Well, you become sucked in when you first encounter it, and you find with a lot of people, they go, "Oh, I love Blake. I really love Blake, but I don't read him. I couldn't read him. You know, it's like there's something off-putting. It's like you come across this extraordinary, you know, I don't know, castle, and you know inside this is just you know, wonders beyond belief, but you don't know how to get in there, and you don't even know if you're allowed in there. You know, part of writing that book was a way in for people to sort of to lead people into the point where they feel, okay, yes, I can, you know, engage him, I can read him, I can sort of do that. But yeah, it's when you start reading him properly that you really grasp just how rich it all is, and just how worthwhile it all is.
So we have a few questions from the audience. Bloviator Bomber asks, wasn't Blake considered delusional or crazy?
Yeah, he was. Absolutely, he was by quite a few people, but not the people who knew him. You know, people who were close to him realised there was more to him than that, and he wasn't. As I say, he wasn't good at explaining what he was on about. As I say, generated this entire mythology of his own creation. He never really sat down and said, look, this character represents this and this character represents that, and in the way that we know what, you know, that Greek god or that Roman god represents. He never sort of explained his thing, and it was very easy to sort of go, well, this is clearly the work of a madman, to the extent that there's a lot of resistance in academics to discuss his state of his mental health. It's a similar thing to Vincent van Gogh, except that with Vincent van Gogh, you know, it's just generally accepted that his mental health issues were part of his story and part of his work and part of what makes him him, and it's just accepted. But with Blake, there was always an attempt to sort of deny that he was in any way sort of mad, because it was so easy to dismiss on that grounds. I think now we're at a point where we can say, yes, his work is important and rich and valid and worth exploring. And there were times in his life when he did have mental health issues. You know, we're at that sort of stage now. You know,
Do you think success would have changed him if he was successful back when he was alive?
I don't think anything would have changed him. It would have, in terms of material comforts, it would have been welcome. He liked a party as much as the next man, but it wasn't his focus. It wasn't where he was focused. It was just of the various north stars that we have to guide ourselves, the sort of goals that we have to guide ourselves. That was really the least important, surely. When you're seeing eternity, 50 quid doesn't matter at all, really. To sort of spend your life obsessing and lusting after gold, what a waste of a life, as when you could have been seeing what Blake was seeing.
Foxtrot Red asks, was William Blake a Freemason?
No, he didn't really join anything. There's been a lot of groups that have tried to sort of claim him. The Druids were very keen to claim him, completely misrepresenting or misunderstanding the references to the Druids in his work. But there's no evidence that he joined a group or anything like that. But it was sort of part of the times, the sort of the background to the sort of the intellectual world he was in. And certainly the character Urizen, who I mentioned a couple of times, who you see with this golden compass sort of creating the world, there's a lot of crossover with Freemason thought and imagery like that. But as an actual, paid his subs and joined up member, no, I don't think so.
Gotcha. Efont asks, I may have missed it earlier, but what is Blake's basic philosophy and his views on metaphysics?
That little one. What is Blake's basic philosophy and his views on metaphysics? As I say, he would have said he was a Christian, except that the light of Christ was the imagination, and that was how the numinous entered the otherwise, cold, limited world and transformed it into something divine. That's the simplest way to answer that, I think.
Awesome. Well, we have been going for about an hour. It was great having you on. Really appreciate the time and the conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Well, I'm easy enough to find. My name is John Higgs. I'm on johnhiggs.com. Google, find me. My book about William Blake is called William Blake versus the World. And it's very much intended, as I say, as a way in, as a way to sort of grasp his mind, rather than a straight, biography or a straight art criticism or any other thing like that. It's much more about sort of grasping his mind, and I hope anyone who picks it up finds it as a way into Blake, because I guarantee, if you have him in your life, you will be grateful for him.
Someone asked a really good question. Logan Fisher asked, is there anyone alive today that has a similar vision?
It's a great question. I mean, I wrote this thing comparing, obviously he's not alive today, but comparing him to Prince, to the musician Prince, because there's a lot of weird similarities in, obviously, Prince also claims to have seen angels and claimed to be cured of epilepsy by an angel he saw as a child. Both saw sexuality and religion as pretty much the same thing, as pretty much the same side of the coin, but both had this compulsion to work, this need to keep creating, just not even for an audience, just for them, between themselves and the angels, essentially. So Prince would always have an engineer on standby at Paisley Park, and at any point in the middle of the night he'd go and record something, he'd create something, and he'd just put it in the vault, and then he'd create something else and put it in his vault, and he just produced work after work after work. And it was the act of creating the work that was important. And Blake was exactly the same. Blake was very, very similar. The amount of work that he produced, it was for the same sort of reasons. So I see a lot of similarity between those two, between Blake and William, between Prince and William Blake, which is useful because it shows that he's not just a one-off. You know, there are people like that throughout time, and because central to his philosophy was like, we should all be like that. We can be like that. You know, we exercise our imaginations, and we will be like that. So it's not just a strange quirk. It is something that happens.
Awesome. Thanks again. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Tom. Lovely talking to you, mate. Cheers.